Gentlemen, we're sad to announce that there's been we're investigating a triple homicide here in the city of Columbia. Deceased at the home at 2854 Robert Drive is a female by the name of Sheri Coleman. She's 31 years old, and her two children, Garrett Coleman, who's 11 years old, and Gavin Coleman, who is 9 years old. The Columbia Police Department was called to this house this morning just before 7 a.m. and they then discovered these bodies, and shortly after that, Chief Edwards felt it his responsibility to give this investigation the most he could, so he activated and authorized the use of the Major Case Squad.
Hey everybody, welcome to Thought Crime, Keto and Crime on YouTube, and Keto Comic on BitChute. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I have another case of family homicide. With all the attention that the Chris Watts case got and all the coverage and things like that, I decided not to actually do that case, but I did go back in history and I found a couple of cases that closely resemble it that didn't get the media coverage that the Chris Watts case did. The first one was the Jeffrey McDonald case. There are, in my archive of podcasts and videos, you will find a two-part episode on, one part on the podcast, episode for the McDonald murders, and today we're going to cover the other one, Chris Coleman. Let's get into it. I also just kind of want to give a little PSA here. In all three of these cases, Coleman, Watts, and McDonald, there was a common theme. A man that really didn't want to be tied down, quote unquote, to a family. So I'm going to put this out there. If you, gentlemen and ladies, if you don't want to get married, if that's really not your jam, don't. Even if there's a pregnancy, which is also a common theme in two of these cases, there are other ways to support a child. There are other ways to be a father. You don't necessarily have to get married. So if you don't want to get married, please don't, because it causes a whole lot of misery for everybody. And these cases are 100% the extreme of that. But if you don't want to get married, don't. And don't put yourself in the predicament where you have to get married. That's just my PSA to you. Think of me as your kindly Aunt Tracy. Anyway, guys, let's continue on with this case. Christopher Coleman was born March 20th, 1977 in Chester, Illinois. This is near Missouri. This is near the Missouri border. He was the child of Connie and Ron Coleman, who were co-pastors of the Grace Church, which is an interdenominational semi-mega church in that area. If you don't know what a mega church is, you're about to learn full force. He was by all means, just your normal Midwestern boy. He grew up, he did well in school, very polite, very well-mannered, a yes ma'am, no ma'am kind of guy. Loved by everybody that knew him, but always just a little introverted. Not really as outgoing, perhaps, as his pastor father was, but definitely a good boy, by all accounts. I mean, you certainly wouldn't want to send him back. After high school, he did join the Marines, where he went on, he excelled in his military training, and he did go on to train to be a K-9 officer at Lackland Air Force Base, because that's where there's a few bases around the country where they train the K-9 officers of all branches of military. He was an MP, wanted to be a K-9 officer, and was sent to Lackland Air Force Base to train. While there, he met an MP on the post there, an Air Force MP on the post, by the name of Sheri Weiss, or Weiss, however you want to say that. And the two started dating. It was kind of one of those whirlwind young relationships, two very attractive young people, military, hormonal, you get the picture. They dated for 3 months. Chris's father, Ron, would often say that he and his mom liked Sheri, but they honestly didn't think that she was the one for their son, which we'll talk more about his parents a little bit later on. And they just thought it was just a whirlwind that would pass, and they really didn't give it much credence until the two went off 3 months after they started dating to a weekend trip to Chicago just to hang out. And while there, the two got married. Why? Because Sheri was pregnant with their oldest son, Garrett, who was 11 years old at the time this crime happened. And Chris called his parents and told them he had married Sheri and there was a grandchild on the way. Ron was shocked because, again, this is a pastor. He wanted his son to do things the old-fashioned way. And also kind of thought that meant that Sheri was a little, quote-unquote, looser than they wanted for their son, and even questioned if the child was even their son's. So this started a long chain of the Colemans not really particularly caring for Sheri. There was think of monster-in-laws. That's kind of what they were. They didn't really care for her. They let their son know that. And even though they carried on a relatively healthy relationship with their grandchildren, 11-year-old Garrett, the oldest, and then later on Gavin, they still made no bones that they didn't really care for their mother and blamed her for, quote-unquote, ruining their son's life. So they married and they moved to the St. Louis suburb of Columbia, Illinois, in a nice 2-story, 3-bedroom house. You know, this was absolutely the American dream. They both left the military, honorable discharged, and started a life in Suburbia. But there was the question of how does a newly married young man just discharged from the Marine Corps support his family? Well, his father had an answer for that.
Hurt us, and then for us to be angry and bitter and resentful, have a chip on our shoulder, spend our life feeling sorry for ourselves, get into all kinds of addictive behaviors, and then spend our lives hating somebody else and hurting somebody else so they can then turn around and do the same thing. And then there it goes from generation to generation to generation. But I'm here to announce good news to you tonight, that if you've been hurt in the past.
That was the voice of well-known TV evangelist Joyce Meyer. She may be one, though she has never been convicted of a crime, she may be one that I do an expose later on, because I have a particular hatred in my heart for religious fanatics who mislead people and bilk people out of money. But Joyce Meyer is a televangelist, mega church pastor. Her church is located in St. Louis or near St. Louis. And Ron's father, Ron, Chris's father, by virtue of having been a pastor for so many years, was well acquainted with Joyce and her husband. They were old family friends, and Joyce had literally known Chris since he was a child. Joyce's ministry brings in something around $54 million a year, is a conservative estimate. She travels all over the world. She is probably one of the most well-known females in the evangelical movement. And as a result, except for Paula White, who, as we all know, is our current president's spiritual advisor, religious advisor, those two need added security because they travel to a lot of countries, developing countries, where women are kind of relegated to a second-class status, and certainly women are not allowed to be pastors. In fact, there's a lot of people that still question Joyce and Paula's rights to pastor, though I'm not religious. As you know, I don't really believe there's a God, but I support people being able to do whatever they want to do and are physically and mentally capable and qualified to do on the normal level. And these two women are. I support their right to be minister. However, this is not a lesson in feminism. I'm not really a feminist I am an old school feminist, but I'm not a feminist as we know today. Not the twisted part of it. But, so bottom line, they need added security. So instead of just the normal security provided by the church or by their speaking venues, Joyce decided to employ her own private security force because she feared getting retaliation. A lot of these ministers are that hated. They get all kinds of kook mail all the time, but maybe some of it's deserved because these people, except for their own personal salaries taken from their church, they do everything they do tax-free. So anything in the church's name, and they normally have their house, their cars, private jets, I kid you not, in the church's name. And so as a result, everything they do through the church is tax-free, and then it funnels into them, even though they have to pay a personal income tax on what they receive as a quote-unquote salary. A lot of these ministers hide things, like they say that their salary wasn't really a salary, it was some kind of gift, things that aren't necessarily taxable. So they do a lot of weird and kind of kooky things. So that's my stance on televangelists and megachurch pastors. Not talking about the minister down on Main Street, don't get me wrong. But Joyce needed added security, and she hired Chris Coleman at a 6-figure salary to be her head of security, protect her while she was in their headquarters in St. Louis, and also while she's on the road. He would travel with her and arrange private security for all their venues. So think of him as her personal bodyguard and security chief. So one might say that Chris's job was an answered prayer for him, quote unquote, because it did provide a 6-figure income. It allowed them to buy that house, and it allowed Sherri to stay home with her boys and be a stay-at-home mom instead of working. So again, perfect suburban existence here. In fact, everybody talked about how lucky the Colemans were. They were considered the type, in this little bedroom community, they were considered, which is a very safe community, low crime rate, just a nice place to live and raise a family. Not a whole lot of crimes there. Think of the town from Turner and Hooch, where Scott Turner is leaving from. Not a whole lot goes on there. Maybe a few bike thieves. So not the type of community where you expect something like what's going to happen would happen. And the Colemans were very lucky to be living there by virtue of Chris's salary. Now, everybody thought that they were the picture-perfect Barbie and Ken type couple. They were a perfect couple. They had 2 perfect children. But things were not as good as well as they seem. In an interview just after this happened, Chris's father, Ron, said that Sherri and Chris were having some issues. In fact, Sherri wasn't performing her quote-unquote wifely duties. And when the interviewer said, "What do you mean wifely duties?" she goes, "Well, she had pulled back from her physical obligations to her husband there for a while, and Chris wasn't exactly happy about it." So, and also I've got some rain starting to come down, but trying to get this out for you guys. Wasn't really fulfilling those duties, and I don't think I need to spell that out. And they were unhappy, and he suspected his son might be starting to turn an eye toward other women, though he tried to talk his son out of it, being a pastor. And Sherri wasn't immune to the problems in the family. She had begun to physically pull away from Chris. She wasn't happy. She didn't feel like she was being treated properly, that Chris was too overly disciplinary with their 2 boys, who were boys. They were bright and vivacious and liked to get into trouble. So she really felt that she was on her way out, had one foot out the door. She even texted a friend a text that read, "Chris wants a divorce. He said me and my kids," and he did say her kids, you and your kids, "are in the way of his job." And the reason being because Joyce Meyer was a Christian organization. Chris had to escort terminated, fired employees out of the building that had been fired for extramarital affairs or divorce that surrounded an extramarital affair. So Chris was kind of caught between a rock and a hard place here to keep the 6-figure job, which were hard to come by in that little community. He didn't want to lose that, but again, he also had got to the point he did not want to be in his marriage. So he had to, I guess, come up with a way he could do both. And about the time their marital problems really started to boil over, Chris, on a trip to Florida with his wife, Sherri, met a woman named Tara, who was Sherri's best friend from high school. And the 2 hit it off. Sherri didn't think much of it, but Chris actually got Tara's contact information, and they began an online long-distance affair. lots of letters, lots of texts. They even have emails where they were planning to get married. All along, Chris is telling Ron that this is just a fling and she's a good friend and blah, blah, blah. But he was telling Tara that he wanted to marry her and have children, and that he was going to file for a divorce from Sheri and move to Florida to be with her. And Tara, of course, was all for this, kind of egged it on. And about that time, Sheri started to get suspicious. She actually pulled up her Facebook, where she was friends with Tara, to tell one of her friends, hey, look, you want to see the woman that my husband's having an affair with? Happy life, huh? Chris started to receive emails on his work email with strange headings like, beware, I'm going to kill Joyce Meyer, I'm going to kill your family, just really weird stuff. Those emails contained threats to the extent, I'm going to punish you if you don't tell Joyce to quit preaching the BS. That was an exact quote. And you better do it or you're going to pay for it. Like, this person was threatening Chris and Chris's family because of what Joyce Meyer was preaching. Started getting a ton of emails. They started getting letters mailed to their house with the same sort of threat. No return post, no fingerprints on the envelopes. And while Chris was in Hawaii, protecting Joyce while she spoke over there, a third letter, which kind of escalated to the point of, if you don't stop her from preaching, I'm going to murder your wife and children very soon, was sent to the house. And Sheri panicked and called Chris and let him know what happened. As soon as he got home, he took all the letters again and tried to file another police report. The police took them into evidence, took their report, dusted them for fingerprints, nothing. So as you can see, this poor woman, Sheri, was dealing with a cheating, kind of aloof, verbally abusive at times, physically abusive at times man, and now a crazy killer that seemed to want to end her and her boy's life because she was married to him. So not a happy circumstance in the year 2009. This is 2009, by the way, for the Coleman family. On May 4th, 2009, Chris Coleman did something very, very out of character for him. He actually called out sick to work. He called Joyce herself, told her he wasn't feeling very well, but he would be in the next day. She said fine, because as she had quoted before, Chris never called out sick. She didn't recall in the entire 11 years that he worked for her him ever really being out sick. So, May 5th, 2009, Chris leaves home about 5:30 a.m. to go to the gym. He calls Sheri around 6 a.m., trying to wake her up. There was no answer. He called again at 6:15, 6:30, 6:51. By the time he had tried to call about 6:30, he said he got a little panicked, and he called their next-door neighbor, detective, local Columbia, Illinois police detective Justin Barlow, to please go over and check on his family because Sheri should be up and she wasn't answering the phone. Of course, Justin obliged. He went across the street to the Coleman house. Chris had told him the code to the garage, how to get in. He went in through the garage into the house. As soon as he got to the stairwell, he called out Sheri's name, didn't hear her. He also that's when he noticed things kind of tossed around the living room as he approached the stairs, and then he started seeing literally the writing on the wall. And for those of you on video, you can see here. For those of you from podcast land, definitely look this up, the Chris Coleman house writings. He saw all kinds of Charles Manson-like messages written around the house. Along the banister leading upstairs, there was, written in bright candy apple red spray paint, there was a "You have paid" written. And as I said, those of you that can see the video can see it right here. Also, as you go up the stairs into the actual second floor, there was "F you, you have been punished." And there were lots of other bizarre messages written all around the Coleman house. So he knew this, Detective Barlow knew this wasn't going to be a good thing. He made his way up he goes into the master bedroom to the left and finds the body of Sheri Coleman, deceased, in her bed with the sheets pulled up over her. She appeared to have been strangled, as the detective noticed ligature marks and bruising on her neck. And he also noticed that she had a black eye and some torn skin, which led him to believe that whoever attacked her, she had put up a fight. I mean, she wasn't a weakling. She was had been an Air Force MP, very athletic. She had definitely tried to fight for her life. Detective Barlow took a deep breath, went into the room across the way, which was the oldest, Garrett's room. Also found Garrett deceased in his bed. Also, the strangulation appeared to be the cause of death. And then further down the hall, you can imagine what he also found in Gavin's bed. The same thing. In the case of Gavin, the sheet was pulled up over him, and there appeared to be remnants of the red paint used to write the bizarre messages both on the sheet and on Gavin himself. Immediately, Detective Barlow calls for backup and full-on investigative. They dispatched the entirety of the Columbia Police Department to come deal with this. It's like I said, this is a small town. Not a whole lot of big crime goes on here. So this is something that they knew they were entirely not equipped to investigate. In fact, once the police chief arrived, Detective Barlow mentioned to him that perhaps they need to bring in a special state and FBI task force to help them with this, which they did, and that was dispatched immediately. Chris arrived home just before 7 o'clock, just after Detective Barlow had came out from the house. By that time, police cars had already arrived, and the house was being roped off. Neighbors started coming out looking. Some of Sheri's friends texted her asking if it was all right. Of course, sadly, she never returned those texts. Chris was taken aside by Detective Barlow and just basically told Chris, "I'm sorry they didn't make it," with his family. And he said Chris collapsed into a slump on the curb and started to cry and was in a sitting fetal position with his knees up and his arms around his knees. They immediately put Chris into a police cruiser to take him for questioning. They told him he was not under arrest at the time. They simply wanted to talk with him. He was interrogated for just a little bit, just simply asking him questions. He told them he had left the house around 5:30, had tried to call and wake Sheri. She didn't wake up, and he called Detective Barlow. That's all he knew. The police detective did note that he was complaining about being too cold, so they gave him a blanket while he was sitting in the interrogation room. Once that simple questioning was done, they did, of course, release him to go back and deal with his family situation. So the investigation started, and one of the first things that kind of tinned off the investigators that perhaps this wasn't as clear-cut homicide as Chris Coleman had told them was that they found several cans of the bright red paint, the same paint that had been used to spray paint the house in Chris's garage. When questioned about this, Chris said that he and Garrett had been working on a racing car for Garrett, and that's for the paint that they used. He had several cans of it, and the thief and the murderer must have taken some of the paint from his garage, although that brought kind of a to the detectives, who wondered why a homicidal person that had this so well planned out, that knew that, the Mansons knew when they went to that house they were going to write strange messages around the house. So they think the same thing applied here. Why would a murderer not go to the scene prepared to write the messages he was evidently going to write? So that was one red flag. The next red flag came when the coroner completed an autopsy and analysis of the three bodies. They were in a certain stage of rigor mortis, and rigor mortis doesn't kick in to several hours after death. And the fact that Coleman told them that he had left for the gym at 5:30 in the morning and then called the detective around 6:30 wanting him to check on them, led them to believe that there wasn't enough time for a murder to take place between 5:30 in the morning and when Chris first started to call, which was just around 6 o'clock in the morning. And definitely, so you got a 30-minute span there. You got an hour between the time Detective Barlow entered the house and the time Chris Coleman left. And then furthermore, you had only about almost a 90-minute lapse from the time that Chris Coleman arrived home. So literally, there was not enough time for the murders to have been completed and the state of rigor mortis that they were starting to go into to be done in anywhere from a 30-minute to an 85-minute time span. So they knew that Chris Coleman's story was bunkus. Sherri and her boys, from their determination, the coroner's determination, had to be dead by at least 3 in the morning at the latest for the stage of rigor mortis they were in to be done. And so at that point, the police knew that they were dead before Chris Coleman left the house. And they brought that to his attention in the following interrogation.
What would you say if I told you that I don't think she was?
I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I think she was. She was.
Okay.
She was laying right beside me.
Right. And I'm not doubting that. I'm not doubting that you were there, and I'm not doubting that you care. But I am doubting that she was alive when you left this morning. Physically, what we have are different ways to tell how long a person's been deceased. That was done. And what do you think that showed?
I don't know. I guess the time frame when I was gone. I mean,
No, you guys wrong. Chris, we need to get this resolved, okay? You can't argue with physical evidence.
right. I'm not trying to.
See, Chris was kind of stammering and sticking around, just saying I know she was alive. I know she was alive. But the very violent way that Sherri died, especially with having fought, they knew there was no way that, literally for what Chris Coleman to say actually happened, the murderer would have actually had to enter the house through the open window that they found, also pictured here for those of you on video, would have literally had to be entering the house at the same time Coleman walked out. And even then, there wouldn't be enough time for the bodies to be in the state of post-death manifestation that they were in. So after a few more questions, Coleman kind of stammering around, police placed him in cuffs and arrested him for the murders of his wife and 2 sons. During breaks in the interrogation, he had been texting his father, Ron. Ron asked him, did he need to get him a lawyer? Chris said he didn't think so. And so after he was placed in custody, Chris did call his parents, who got him a lawyer. They got him out on bond. But as you can imagine, the scrutiny he was under led him to leave their small community and move in with his parents during the trial. And the task force, upon further examination of all of the electronic devices in the Coleman house, including those at Chris's office at Joyce Meyer Ministries, concluded, the IP address alone concluded, that every single one of those threatening emails that he had been receiving came from his own computer from a throwaway email account. Also, the letters that were mailed were also presumed to have also been written by Chris Coleman. The trial finally concluded in 2011, and as a result of the overwhelming evidence, plus the fact that the police force did locate Tara and go down and talk to Tara, because Chris Coleman had told them that he had never had an extramarital affair, that Tara was just a friend. Well, the same time that they were interviewing Chris Coleman in that clip I just showed you, where they were starting to tell him that his story wasn't holding water, they were also questioning Tara in Florida, who was saying the exact opposite of what Coleman was saying. They realized that Tara did not know anything about the murder. She was expecting him just to divorce his wife. And as a result, she did testify against him in the trial. And he was found guilty of the murder of his wife and 2 sons and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison, where he still sits in Missouri. Although he is still filing appeals, he's saying he deserves a new trial because he couldn't get a fair trial in the state of Illinois or Missouri, but because of the way the media put forth the case and stigmatized him. But as of yet, he has not been granted a new trial. And so that's the story of Chris Coleman, guys. Very sad. Totally uncalled for. And your whole thing, why didn't he just divorce his wife? Well, I'll let Joyce Meyer tell you in her own words why Chris couldn't divorce his wife.
I have to ask you, if the defendant were having an affair, if you had known that at the time, and I understand you've testified that you didn't, what effect would that have had on his employment?
If he would have been having an adulterous affair while he was still married, then it could have definitely affected his job.
Okay. Were there persons over the years that were terminated in situations like that?
We had situations where they were, yes.
And in fact, he was married during the period of time that he worked for you, married to Sheri Coleman, correct?
Yes.
Were there other persons who had adulterous affairs while married whose employment was terminated at Joyce Meyer Ministry?
Yes.
For that reason?
Yes.
Okay.
Not saying that she was a cause of it, but I think his desire to put on airs and to keep his cash cow of a job was very much a reason why he decided to end his marriage this way instead of in a divorce court. And guys, I hope you enjoyed this. On Sunday, I will be doing the story of the man that is the basis for 3 of our major movie horror villains. He's the basis for Norman Bates and Psycho. He's the basis for Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, and he was the basis of Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Sunday, I'll be tackling the story of Ed Gein, and if you have a weak stomach, I highly advise you to be cautious when checking out that one. But I will be back with you soon on Thought Crime, on Keto and Crime, and on the Keto Comic, guys. Please like, comment, share, subscribe. Tell me what stories you'd like me to tell and research for you. Put them down below. On my podcast, send me a voice message, which you can through Anchor FM. Tell me what you'd like me to cover. I really appreciate all the support, guys. Thank you so much. Keto Comic.